I was looking through some of the photography collections recently, partly because I'm changing the photographs that I currently have for sale. And it occurred to me that I don't really speak very much about the animals themselves. So I thought I'd start a kind of mini series that I'll run every few weeks, just do a new one every few weeks, where I talk about a particular animal that I've photographed and really tell you a bit more about the animal, because I think there are often things that we don't know. And I've certainly learned a lot through photographing animals and then doing research on them. And I've learned things that I wasn't aware of. So I found it an interesting journey. So I hope you'll find these podcasts interesting as well. So I'm going to start with elephants. Now, if you didn't know, they're the largest living land animal that we have on the planet currently. You can find them in sub-Saharan Africa, in South Asia and Southeast Asia. And basically they're the survivors, if you like, of a group of animals that also includes woolly mammoths, which most of us are familiar with, and also the mastodon, which is a North American animal. So that group has evolved, as with all animal groups. Some species within the group have survived and others haven't done so well. Now, just to give you an idea, so I'm going to throw a lot of facts at you in this, but I'll try and make it more interesting. Elephants typically live to between 60 and 70 years of age. They reach maturity, and I'm defining that as reaching their full height, by the time they get to about 35, so between 35 and 40 years of age. So quite a slow growing, relatively long-lived animal. They're going to weigh anything from 3,000 to 7,500 kilograms. Now, I apologize to anybody who's used to pounds and feet and all of that stuff. I'm going to stay metric. So there you go. Now, they spend a lot of their time eating, which can be anything up to 2/3 of their day just eating. And they'll eat most vegetation. So that's grass, plants, bushes, fruit, tree bark, roots, anything at all like that. So they're not particularly fussy eaters. But when they are eating, they can eat anything up to, I think it's 150 kilos in a day. So that's why they spend so much of their time eating. Now, I'm going to talk about how that impacts their ecosystem as I work through this. But the thing about elephants is that they are what we refer to as a keystone species. And that is that when they're in an area, they have a big impact on the flora and fauna in that area. So much as in the same way a keystone will keep an arch together, if you think of an arch of stones or bricks, an elephant and animals like that who are defined as keystone species have a huge impact on the area that they live in and the animals that also form a part of that ecosystem. Now, I'm going to talk about the different species. So there are actually 3 recognized subspecies, if you like, at the moment. You've got the African bush elephant, which is also known as the savanna elephant. If you think of an African elephant, that's probably the elephant that you're thinking of. There is also a species called the African forest elephant. Now, they live in the Congo basin. I don't even have numbers for them, but it's quite a small population of animals. They differentiate from the bush elephant because they have straighter tusks and they have a more rounded ears. So the differences between them are fairly subtle, but they have been defined as separate species, whereas the African desert elephant, which was at one stage defined as a subspecies, and they're in Namibia and Mali, they're now regarded as African bush elephants, even though they look slightly different, but that's put down more to diet. And then, of course, the other major species is the Asian elephant, and they look a little bit different. So I'm going to talk about the differences in a moment. So, in fact, I want to talk about them right now because I'm referring to some notes I made earlier just to make sure I don't forget anything important. So, very briefly, if you were to look at the two elephants, and let's talk about the African bush elephant, the savanna elephant, and the Asian elephant. If they're side by side, the African can get taller, so the bulls will grow up to about 4 meters in height and weigh about 7,500 kilograms, whereas the Asian will grow up to 3.5 meters in height and weigh up to about 6,000 kilos. So the Asian is a little bit smaller. Probably the most obvious difference between the two is their ears. So the African elephant has very large ears, which obviously they use for cooling, whereas the Asian elephant has much smaller ears, and they're obviously smaller. So even if you don't have an African elephant to compare against, you will immediately see it's a much smaller ear. Now, there are some more subtle things that differentiate the two as well. The first is the head. So on an Asian elephant, it has what we refer to as a twin-domed head. There's an indentation in the middle of the head, and then the bumps on the head are referred to as dorsal bumps. But basically, the Asian, if you look at it, has two bumps on its head, whereas the African is just a single dome for its head. Another difference is in the tusks. So in the African elephant, the tusks, and I'm going to talk about those in a bit more detail in a moment, but both males and females have tusks, whereas with the Asian elephant, it's just the males that have tusks. And then, even more subtly, if you look at the tip of the trunk, and the trunk's an amazing piece of equipment on both species, but if you look at the tip of the trunk, the African elephant has what we refer to as two fingers. So there are actually two projections at the end of the trunk that look a little bit like fingers, whereas the Asian only has a single finger on the end of the trunk. So that means the African elephant can pick things up with these fingers on the tip of its trunk. So it gives it the ability to, in a very kind of fine-tuned way, to pick up very small objects, whereas the Asian elephant doesn't have that ability. Now, the skin on the African elephant tends to be more wrinkled. It tends to be more uniform in colour, whereas on the Asian elephant, you tend to get more spots. Sometimes there are more pinkish areas, and it's a smoother skin. So that, broadly speaking, that I think the main differences between the two, and that's how you can tell one from the other. Obviously, if you're in a particular part of the world, if you're in Africa, you're more likely to see an African elephant. If you're in Asia, you're more likely to see an Asian elephant. But that's another clue. Okay, so just to give you an idea of populations, now the bad news is that certainly with the African elephant, in the last 100 years, 90%, or it's estimated that 90% of the animals that were around 100 years ago have now gone. And the population is estimated at somewhere around the 300,000 to 400,000 mark. So that's the number of African elephants in the wild. So on the upside, about 400,000 animals. With the Asian elephant, there's far fewer. There's between 40 and 50,000 Asian elephants in the wild, and that has a direct impact on how they're rated in terms of their potential to go extinct. The African elephant is rated as vulnerable, whereas the Asian elephant is rated as endangered. So the bad news is that unless we do really take care with both of the major elephant groups, but particularly with the Asian, they're likely to disappear. So looking at how they group, broadly speaking, and I've got a bit of poetic license here as well, but broadly they're the same, but they'll tend to form groups, and the group is, these are known as herds, obviously, and they're led by the dominant female. So it's a matriarchal society, and it's typically the oldest female that runs the herd or the group, and that can be anywhere in size from anything as small as 8 animals up to about 100. And occasionally you get aggregations, so presumably collections of groups, maybe around waterholes at certain times of year, where there could be as many as 1,000 elephants. So that would be a huge collection of animals, obviously. Now, also within that group are all the female animals and then all the young animals. So what I mean by that is any animals that are prepubescent. This really applies to the males because once they reach around anywhere from sort of 12 to 15 years, once they hit puberty, they then leave the group. And often males will spend most of the rest of their life on their own, traveling on their own. And it was thought until very recently, and I read something, I think it was about 3 years old now, that elephants didn't form what's referred to as bachelor herds. So most grazing mammals will form bachelor herds. They often have this similar sort of setup where the main herds with the females tend to have a dominant male. They won't have many competing males there, so it tend to be a dominant male and then the young animals and the female animals. But you'll also find groups that are just males, so they're referred to as bachelor herds. And it was thought until very recently, until a bachelor herd of elephants was found in Namibia, that elephants didn't do that, but apparently they do. And I think this underlines as well that as much as we like to think we know a lot about these animals, and it's fair to say we do know a fair bit, there's always new things we can find out about them and their behaviours. And this is what, to me, makes a lot of this wildlife in general very interesting, and also wildlife conservation, wildlife photography. Okay, so some other things that might be interesting to you, you might not know. Elephants can hear what's known as infrasounds, so that's very, very low frequency sounds, much lower than our ears can hear, and that means they can pick up vibration and noise through the ground, through their skin, through their bones. And it's a way that they can communicate. And one of the advantages of using infrasound is that it can travel very large distances. So anything up to 20, 25 kilometers, or possibly even further. So they can hear storms coming, things like that, long before we would. And it's also a form of communication that they have. So again, that was something I only learned about fairly recently. Now, something I did grow up with was a thing called the elephant's graveyard, which you may have heard about. I think it was put together by early explorers, African explorers, because they didn't see elephants dying. They didn't find elephant remains except, and I believe they found them in large groups of elephants. So this whole story about elephants going off to this sort of mythical elephant's graveyard to die, that whole story started. Well, unfortunately, or fortunately, whichever way you care to view it, that is a myth. And where you do get these large collections of elephant bones is probably where there was a drought and they'd gone to a water hole, maybe the kind of last resort water hole to try and find enough water to survive, and they unfortunately all died. And it's unfortunately this is what happens around these areas, these water holes in situations of extreme drought. Animals, and this is particularly true of the matriarch in a mammal herd, these animals know where to find water in almost any situation, and this is why they lead the herd. So they can take the herd to find water, they know where to find food, they know the migration paths if they perform an annual migration. So all of that is what the matriarch, if you like, brings to the party. That's what the animal does. Now, I've spoken about this in another podcast, but when I was in Zimbabwe at Nakavango, the guy who was leading the conservation program there, very, very experienced guy with many, many years of experience in the field. And he was telling the story of what they used to do, and I think it's still done in some places, is that where you have a local overpopulation of elephants, and I've mentioned they're a keystone species, so although their numbers are greatly reduced, you still have a problem if there are more elephants in an area than that area can support. What they used to do was just take a group of them, take a number of those elephants and just relocate them somewhere else, tranquilize them, stick them in a truck or use a helicopter, whatever it might be, to relocate them somewhere else. And they have done this with small herds, but what they found was that the matriarch in that situation would quite often go mad. And the thinking behind this, and obviously we don't know for sure, but it seems reasonable, is that the matriarch didn't know the new area. Suddenly she didn't know where to find water. She didn't know where to find food. And the rest of the herd are relying on her. Obviously young animals as well that are very dependent on her knowledge and the support of the rest of the herd. And he said that on occasion they would see the matriarch go mad. So his proposal, and this is something that I've spoken about before, which I found quite shocking when I first heard it, but again, it does make sense. His proposal, if you like, or what they propose, is that where there is an overpopulation of elephants, they take a family group and they shoot it. So, as I say, that's quite a shocking idea. But the other reason for doing that is that it's been observed many times now that elephants are not only very intelligent animals, but they've got very strong emotional bonds within their own herd. And that emotional synergy, if you like, extends to other species. So when I was in Botswana going off to do some photography, the guy there was telling me about a situation. I've related this in other podcasts as well, I believe. It was a situation where a young calf had died and the mother stayed with it for 3 days, and she'd keep stroking it with her trunk. She'd be rocking it, trying to get the calf to come back to life, as it were. And in the end, after 3 days, the rest of the group had to move on. And obviously they had to leave the baby calf behind. And unfortunately, there were a lot of Nile crocodiles about, or circle of life, however you want to look at it. But it was one of those examples where elephants do appear to grieve when they lose a member of the herd. And this has also been seen where they'll come to the aid of another animal. They can bond with other animals like people, dogs and other animals. And they've also been seen to intervene when another animal is being attacked by a predator. So they're very interesting animals from that perspective, from the level of their intelligence. Now, I believe they've got the biggest brain of any land animal, although big brains don't necessarily equate to intelligence. But nonetheless, I find it very interesting that they have this whole behavior, which is very interesting to learn about and to observe if you're lucky enough to have that opportunity. So, just talking about the trunks for a moment, because they're very interesting. They've got around 150,000 muscles in them, so it's the most muscular of any appendage, I think, of any mammal in terms of number of muscles contained within it. When you see a young animal, a baby, they can't use their trunks immediately. So it takes them a little while, it takes them a few months to just get the grip of how to use their trunks. So they'll often stand on them. When they're suckling, they have to use their mouth. They can't use the trunk. But once they can get to use the trunk, they obviously can breathe through it. So if they're underwater, they can use it as a snorkel. And elephants can swim, but they also can use it as a snorkel. For baby elephants, they've been observed sucking their trunk, and it's thought that, again, this is a behavior very similar to human babies just sucking their thumb. Baby elephants will do the same thing, and presumably for comfort, which is why baby people do that. Now, trunks as well can lift an awful lot of weight, definitely up to about 350 kilos. They've been observed, if they brace themselves, to lift 500 kilos even of logs when they've been used to move logs. So the trunk is very, very strong. But as I mentioned before, they have these fingers at the end of it, and the African elephants have these 2 fingers. So for something that's so strong, they can also use it to do very fine gripping with their fingers. And it's in some ways similar to our arms. If you think about it, our arms are quite impressive limbs, because on the one hand, we can lift quite a lot of weight depending on who you are, how much you work out. But on the other hand, we're very dexterous. We can do very fine work with our fingertips. So there's this combination of a sort of very broad lifting ability and then being able to do very fine work. And for an elephant, the trunk operates in a very similar way. Now, obviously, the tusks are another key a feature of elephants, if you like. And as I've mentioned before, female Asian elephants don't have tusks. I think I said tusks then, but if I didn't, that's what I meant to say. So the tusk is basically a modified second incisor from the upper jaw. So they don't have them immediately. They have milk teeth initially, which are then replaced by tusks. And tusks have an outer layer of enamel like the other teeth, and that obviously protects them. And tusks continue to grow throughout the animal's life. So if you want to get an idea, just a rough idea of how old an elephant is, you can look at its size, because as I've mentioned, it takes them a while to grow to full adult size. But another clue is how long and how broad the tusks are. So obviously an old animal will have very long tusks, and a young animal will have very small tusks. So it gives you a rough idea just by looking at an animal, how old that animal is. Now, another thing about tusks, and this is another way in which elephants are similar to us, you'll often see that one tusk is more worn than the other, and they're a bit like Swiss Army knives. They use them for digging. They use them to scrape bark off trees. They'll use them if they're fighting to defend themselves, although they have no predators as such. But they tend to prefer one tusk over the other, so you'll see that one might be more worn than the other, and there might be a noticeable difference between them. And this is, again, thought to be because they prefer one over the other. And it's a bit like us either being left-handed or right-handed. We prefer to use one hand over the other. So again, another similarity between us and elephants. Now, another thing that you might not be aware of is that elephants can sleep standing up, but they can also lie on their side and sleep. And I've seen this in, I've seen the track in Zimbabwe when I was tracking elephant on foot. There were two elephants we were tracking, and there was a big indentation in the sand where one elephant had slept, and you could even see a mark in the sand where its tusk had been. And earlier, before I went to Zimbabwe, I was in Namibia, and on one occasion, in fact on two occasions, we're in a four-wheel drive. We came going down this dried riverbed, came around the corner, and there was a small group of, I think, 5 or 6 elephants. And there were, I think the first time, 2 young elephants lying on the ground. And my first thought was, I wondered if they were ill or dead, if something had happened. But in fact, they were just sleeping, because the other elephants, we'd stopped and were watching them. And the other elephants just nudged them, and up they got, and off they went. So you will see elephants. And in fact, I saw a really good photograph that was taken by a drone as well of just a whole family of elephants asleep, lying on their side. So they do sleep on their side. Now, just talking about their skin, while I'm sort of going through, I'm kind of going in and out a bit of their physical attributes, but they do have very thick skin. It's about 2.5 centimeters thick, but it's also quite sensitive. So something else that you will see a lot, particularly with African elephants, I've seen this a lot with African elephants, is they'll spray themselves with mud, or they'll throw dust over themselves. And there's some brilliant video I've seen and brilliant photographs of an elephant just getting a trunk load of dust and just throwing it, spraying it over its own body. And the reason that they do that is that their skin can be quite sensitive. It's sensitive to sunburn, and it's sensitive to insect bites. So they spray themselves with mud and with dust as a way of putting sunscreen on, and also protecting their skin from parasites. So that's basically why they do that. Now, that's also why they might appear to be quite strange colours at times. And that's generally because it's the colour of the mud or the dust they've been spraying themselves with. Okay, so obviously I've spoken about how endangered elephants are. And one of the things that puts them at more risk is that they have quite a long gestation period. Their gestation period is around 22 months. So and usually in a herd, there'll be one breeding male. So there'll be a dominant male that mates with the females. And while that male is able to, while it's fertile, basically that's fine. But if the dominant male becomes infertile through age, that does mean that other males won't mate with those females. So that can be a problem. And it's a problem that has been noted in Namibia when I was over there. Now, once they're born, calves are pretty big. They're anything from 90 to 115 kilos when they're born. So they're pretty big. They're actually able to stand within about 20 minutes of birth. And then after around 2 days, they're able to keep up with the herd. So obviously from a survival point of view, that's very important. I've said that elephants don't have any natural predators, but that's the adults. Obviously any young animal is fair game, depending on its size. But a young baby elephant would certainly be something that a pride of lions could take down. So there is this need with any of these animals, and this is quite common in the wild, that newborns are able to stick with the herd in a very short time, so that if the herd has to move on or the group has to get out of the way for any reason, they've got the best possible chance of surviving. And as I've mentioned before as well, the elephants will, as a group, look after the young. So they tend not, unless an elephant, a young one, wanders off, the group will protect it. So they do demonstrate that behavior quite often. Okay, so I'm going to just talk about the eating habits. So I've mentioned that they spend a lot of their day eating. That can be anything from 12 to 18 hours. They will deposit around, or rather they eat about 150 kilos a day. And that means they'll deposit in droppings, let's say around 1 metric ton a week. So that's quite a lot. And elephant droppings do have various uses. Apparently it's good the dried stuff, if you set fire to it, it keeps mosquitoes away. But I can't testify to that, but apparently that's one of the uses. But obviously what they do is they're processing vegetation, they're pocking it out, and their dung is quite fertile. And in fact, when I've seen fresh dung, it's kind of like a big party for dung beetles. And what I've noticed is that the new stuff is obviously quite warm as well, because it comes out at body temperature. So if you do want to stick your fingers in there, it's quite warm. Obviously, it cools down over a period. And what I've noticed is you get different species of dung beetle having a different party depending on the temperature of the dung that they're using as a venue. So there you go. So elephant dung, though, is important for fertilizing the soil. It's also a great way of transporting seeds, both from plants and trees. So again, they're very important. They have an impact on the flora. One of the areas where they can be a problem if there's an overpopulation is that they'll tend to overeat the flora that's there. So certain plants, let's say it's taller plants, that might mean it's difficult for giraffe to feed in that area if their food source is gone. And with the taller plants going, that may allow the shorter plants greater sunlight, greater rain, and give them an opportunity to really get established and prevent the taller plants from reestablishing themselves. So this is how they can make a difference to the flora of an area. And if you've seen where elephants have gone through, if you look at what they leave behind, the word for that it's completely gone out of my head. Anyway, I've seen where elephants have gone through, and there's broken twigs and branches and all sorts everywhere. So they can be very destructive, and this is also where they can come into conflict with humans. And the biggest threats to them, poaching is a major one for elephant ivory from the tusks, which is just crazy anyway. That's a major threat to the elephants that are left. But of course, another threat to them is our encroachment on their traditional ground, the areas they would use to just travel and feed. And elephants can, as I said, can be incredibly destructive. That means if you're a farmer and even a small herd of elephants go through, they can do untold damage to your crops, to your infrastructure, your well, your water towers, anything like that. If you're trying to use solar power, that can be destroyed. So they can do an awful lot of damage. And this is why when I was in Namibia, EHRA, which is one of the projects I support through sales of my photographs, they build solid infrastructure, so walls around these things. I was working on a water tower, but they do it so that the elephants can't get to it to destroy it. And they also work very actively with the local population so that they can live in harmony with the elephants. And if you've listened to me speak about elephants in Namibia before, you'll know that I spoke to some local people when I was there, and they regarded elephants as almost a boogeyman. There was almost a superstitious fear of them because they can just pop up. They can travel a large distance overnight and they can just suddenly be there. Elephants are very short-sighted. They can be easily startled if they don't realize a person is there, for example, and they might attack. And this is where often where the fatalities occur. So it is really important that where people do live with wild animals like this, that there's support there to help them live together, and also to help farmers have a good quality of life. That's really important because they see TV, they see what people have in the West, and they want the same thing. So they don't really want to take one for the team so that elephants can continue. That would be nice, but it's not how it works. So those of us who don't live with elephants, I think it's really important that we continue to support those who are trying to work and live alongside them. And I even saw some video recently, I think it was in India, where there was a small group of Asian elephants had gone through, and they were actually, throwing fuel onto the elephants and setting fire to them to drive them out. So it can get pretty nasty. And obviously, a lot of work needs to be done if we're to keep these animals around so that future generations can see them. It does need a concerted effort to protect the animals, protect the areas they need, whereas at the same time allowing people to have a decent quality of life with them. So anyway, I've spoken quite a bit about that. So that's a bit of a bee that I have in my bonnet, as you've probably noticed. So that really, I think, concludes what I wanted to cover on the elephants. So the idea of this was just to give you hopefully just some basic insights into some of these animals, a little bit of background to them, and hopefully there's one or two things in there that you weren't aware of. And the plan, as I say, is that I'll do more of these podcasts about a specific animal, maybe once a month or so, and hopefully they'll be of interest to you. And if you want to see any of my photographs, obviously you can do on the website. If you go to ge.photography, I think that's www.ge.photography, but that's my website. There are all sorts of wildlife prints there for sale. And what I do, a minimum of 10% of the money that I get from the sales of my fine art prints goes to a couple of projects at the moment. And I'm also supporting sort of planting trees. But the two projects right now are EHRA in Namibia, which is Elephant Human Relations Aid, where they're working with African desert elephants. And then the other one is a group called Half Cut in Sydney, who buy up plots of the Daintree rainforest in Queensland so that can't be developed, because rainforest is an extraordinarily rich environment for flora and fauna, and so much of it is unknown. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed that, and I'll speak to you in the next podcast. Bye for now. Oh, and one thing just before you go, please take a look at the 2026 wildlife calendar. That's available now. It's on the website. There's a link below the description of this podcast episode. So please take a look, and I'll speak to you next time. Bye now.